Hi, welcome to News Laundry Interviews. Today I have a very special guest with me, Hindol Sengupta. Before I introduce him and the book that he's written, I just want you to remember that when the public pays, the public is served. When the corporations pay, corporations are served. So let me introduce Hindol Sengupta to you. Hindol has led a very varied life. He has been to Jamia. He is a filmmaker and he's an author of 6 books. The last one before the book that I have in my hand was Recasting India.
That's right.
And Hindol has recently written a book called Being Hindu. And I found this book to be very fascinating, full of anecdotes, and very different from a large plethora of books that have been written on Hinduism or religion or what being a Hindu actually means. And this is the first question that I have for Hindol, is that how did you manage to create, or when you were thinking of writing this book, Hindol, obviously you had more than a dozen books that are still available on that talk of Hinduism and what being a Hindu is. Did you actually think from the beginning that I'm going to write something different, or was it just something that came out into a book?
So I'll give you some perspective to this, Anand, and thanks very much for inviting me to the show. Look, as I was hearing the extremely polemical conversation that our country was having, and extreme viewpoints on both sides, and every side, if I may say so, I was very disconcerted that actually the voice of the average, common, practicing Hindu was completely cut out. People speaking for Hinduism were either extremely against the faith or extremely in a very curious, contorted sort of way for the faith. But the experience of the average Hindu, was completely cut out. Somebody like me who belongs to the faith and has always had a very ordinary, everyday belief system, which is, I believe, in every sense, non-threatening, inclusive, engaging, intellectual, scientific. All of this was being cut out. All those words I never heard in the conversation, right? I heard a lot of labeling, but I heard very little of real analysis and real understanding. And I delved into my own life, which I often do in my writing, and I found an entire wealth of material, which I then connected to the larger context, which includes, why is there a Nataraj at one of the biggest atomic research centers in the world? Why is there a dancing Shiva there at CERN, right? What does Hinduism have to do with quantum physics, right? What are the scientific methodologies of meditation that we ought to be talking about? Did the Aryans really invade India on horseback, and should we all believe in the Aryan invasion theory? All of these questions I found had very clear scientific answers, and those answers were not being talked about. And I wrote this book to address those answers for people like you and me, who don't believe in this, in having a militant conversation, who believe in a regular conversation, an everyday conversation with simple beliefs, simple scientific thoughts and processes. And that's how the book came about. That's why the book is called not just Being Hindu, it's called Old Faith, New World and You.
Right.
And that's why in the book I talk about this whole thing that, there's this derogatory term that has been invented called the internet Hindu, right?
Yes.
Which I find isn't completely...
Don't give me my questions. That was but I mean, in fact,
we'll come to it. I'll let you ask me that question later in the conversation. We'll come to it.
Yeah.
But essentially, just to conclude,
yes,
to hold up the kind of scientific realization of Hinduism that I grew up with, which I did not find in contemporary India and the conversation that contemporary India was having about Hinduism. Right. That's why this book.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, you yourself, in fact, it's full of anecdotes, and that's what actually I could relate as a reader to this book, because I have read a number of books on Hinduism, and they somehow always all end up talking down towards you. I mean, when one is talking of religion, unless one is interested in academics,
that's right.
I suppose a dinner table conversation is much more cogent form of talking about religion, where you have a debate and you might be wrong, you might be right. In fact, one of the things that struck me was that your contents, which list the chapters, all the chapters headings end with a question mark.
That's right.
Was that deliberate? Was that that's the first thing I noticed, that I think this is wonderful. This is, in fact, this is what, according to me, Hinduism is. That you, first of all, do you agree that is it a religion or is it a way of life? Is it a philosophy?
So I think this way of life business is flawed.
Right.
I have never agreed with the phrase way of life. I just think the moment you say way of life, you make it too open-ended, and Hinduism is extremely open-ended, but not in the way that the phrase way of life suggests.
Okay.
I believe Hinduism is better defined as a philosophy,
Right.
as a mental process of evolution, as a cerebral process of evolution, as an engagement, a theory of engagement with the world, which combines ideas from what we are inside and what we are outside. So it is best explained as a philosophy, even more than a religion. It's best explained as a philosophy, but I don't agree with the phrase way of life. So, but just to quickly answer the question about why does each chapter end with a question?
Yes.
Look, what is the defining? In the book, I make a comparison, for instance, between Genesis and the Nasadya Sukta.
Yes.
The two origin themes between Christianity and Hinduism, right? If you read Genesis, it's a very clear linear structure of how God created the world, and then God created man, right? If you read the Nasadya Sukta, it talks about how in the beginning there was neither truth nor untruth, right?
Yes.
And it goes on to a whole bunch of these questions. It was neither this, neither that. And it ends. And here's the interesting thing. To me, the most, really the crux of the Hindu argument, so to speak. It ends with this line, which is so beautiful and so evocative for me. It says, perhaps, so what was it? At the end it asks, what was it? So if it was neither this nor that, what was it? And it says, maybe God knows, right? And then immediately after that says, but maybe even he doesn't know.
Right, yes.
It is in this questioning attitude. It is in this idea that, look, why is people keep saying, oh, Hinduism doesn't have one foundational text and no one single figure, right? No one prophet, no one messenger, right? But why is that true? Because the foundations of Hinduism talk about an open-ended question.
Yeah.
It is what you discover. So if you believe today that Hinduism is for you and God is for you in this glass of water, so be it. Right? I mean, we talk about 33 million or 333 million gods and goddesses, but even after all that, say you don't like any of those gods and goddesses.
Right.
There's a concept of Ishta Devta.
Yeah.
So that glass of water could be your god, and that's perfectly fine. But that comes from the very core, the very foundation of Hinduism. That question mark is, if you were to ask me, apart from other sort of insignia, what would be that one symbol through which I would define Hinduism, it would be the question mark. And that's why the question mark ends every chapter in the book.
Right. So, I mean, which actually brings us to the question, which is that if it is a philosophy, it is by definition in the realms of questioning.
Yes.
I mean, anybody who reads it would automatically interpret it in his or her own way, would have their own set of questions and their own set of answers.
Sure.
So, it may not be a way of life, but is it religion?
It depends on how you mean religion. It is this is why some of the terminology which is essentially invented by the West is incorrect in an Indian context. So the phrase Sanatan Dharma is a far better concept, a universal law. So yes, I would think of it more as a law than the rigid definition of a religion, right? Because I think the moment you say religion, and I mentioned this in the book, I read Richard Dawkins, right? The God Delusion, the famous book, The God Delusion. That entire book, which talks about how the belief in God is delusional, mentions Hinduism only twice.
Yes, I saw that.
One as a factoid, and the other as a very brief passing reference. So this entire battle of streamlined ideologies and the entire theology and the semantics behind those streamlined ideologies does not apply to Hinduism. That's why when we try to box it and say, oh well, then is it a religion and therefore it must follow the diametrics of those religion, or how would it apply if we put that term religion on top of it, and wouldn't it therefore follow these rules and parameters? All of those fall apart.
Right. I mean, we're going to come to that in a minute. I'm going to be talking about, I think one of the chapters which I found glorious, in fact, was Is God Afraid of Science? So I'm going to be discussing that a little bit, particularly because I find science and religion are constantly debated,
Yes.
but it's in a way where the debate is somehow always taken so far away from science that people may come to the conclusion that, you know, Hinduism, which I personally do not consider as a religion.
Right.
And before you kind of negated the thought, I used to think it was a way of life, but let's say philosophy.
But that's all
A lot
right.
of
I mean, let us use any phrase that we like. I mean, you know, I mean, if you feel closer to that phraseology, so be it. I mean, I personally, I mean, I'm not militant about it. I just have a point of view which I wish to express. But I don't think there is any need to be militant about anything.
But what you find, Hindol, increasingly, in fact, there's one of the questions that you asked, that do people really believe that Hinduism as we know it was invented in the 19th century?
Yes.
In fact, if you go to Twitter or to, in fact, you are on Twitter, you get a lot of flack as well. So does everyone. But increasingly you find that people whom I suppose when you write a book, you're not really targeting at an audience. But I mean, the title of your book and the subtitle do reflect that you want young readers to read it, young people to read it, you know. Not people who necessarily confused about what being Hindu is.
You'll be surprised how many much older people are also are completely confused. Because look, I mean, one of the things. No, I'll let you complete your question.
I mean, so the question was, when you take the young people who say, you know, Virat Hindu, Garv se kahu Hindu, this that. It's not really a questioning philosophy that has, you know, pervaded for the last 5,000 years, is it? So I would like to have your views on that. I mean, how far removed the present generation's thinking of what being a Hindu is from what actually you perceive and, in fact, your book says being Hindu is.
So there are two things here. Look, I think we cannot expect everybody to have a philosophical bent of mind. That's not true for anything in the world. You know, it's not true for religion, but you take anything. I mean, science, you're a scientist. I mean, or you know, I work with culture as a journalist. I mean, it's not true for anything. You cannot have people who are philosophical about everything in the world. And same, of course, applies to Hinduism. Look, one of the problems is that we have been, and Anand Kumaraswamy wrote so beautifully about it, that we have been torn away from our cultural heritage through colonialism, and before that through, you know, centuries of invasions, with violence. We have been torn away. We are a generation, a race, a civilization that has been brutally cut off, and not just our generation, but generations before us, has been brutally cut off from our roots. I'll give you an example, right? And this is a conversation I once had with Rohan Murthy when he was announcing his classical library at Harvard, that, you know, when Manjul Bhargav won the Fields Medal, right, he spoke about the contribution and how Brahmagupta's contribution helped him to really understand some of the nuances of mathematics that he applied in his own work, right? Now,
in fact, you mentioned Brahmagupta.
I mentioned Brahmagupta extensively and Aryabhatta and all these people in detail. Now tell me, when it is because Manjul Bhargav won the Fields Medal that some of us even knew who Brahmagupta was. Were we, and this is a question that, you know, Rohan Murthy asks in terms of poets. So he says, you know, we were taught all the great English poets and so on and so forth, but were we ever taught about Kalidas? Right? And the same questions apply to every part of our civilization, right? We were taught about so many things, but were we ever taught about Brahmagupta, Aryabhatta? Where is this entire civilizational context and contribution that Hinduism has made to the Indian civilization, which we are never taught about? Where is the conversation about that? We have never been taught about any of these things.
So do you think much of the agitation, if I may call it so, it's rather reactionary force against, you know, against people who probably are ignorant of Hinduism or who do not consider themselves Hindus? I mean,
I think there are two things there. One is a lot of
because there is a lot of it.
It is a lot of it. It is a lot of it, and I have two responses to that. Look, it's happening because of one thing. We unfortunately had an extremely left bent in our academia, which always in some senses pushed anything that was Hindu in the back burner as something, which is primitive, backward, not to be considered. Those were the prisms through which our Hindu history was perceived. And therefore, for a lot of us, it's almost like the history that we have learned begins in the 15th century.
Right.
But there are centuries of history that India has before that, and we don't know much about it. And that comes from politics. And I mean, that's an entirely separate conversation. But because of the political, venom in our entire system, we know very little. So the anger comes from, look, here's the example that I want to give to you. I went to one of Calcutta's best known Protestant schools, right?
Yes, yes.
And I talk about that in the
talk
book.
About it, yeah.
Today, if you wake me up from sleep, I can tell you the Lord's Prayer backwards, right? But I wasn't taught, I mean, apart from a little bit at home, I wasn't taught anything about why do Hindus, use mantras. What does a mantra mean? What does a sloka mean? What does the Gayatri mantra mean? In fact, in my recent conversation with a dear friend, I began to have this conversation how the first surah of the Quran and the Gayatri mantra and the similarities between them. But who taught us all of these things? Nobody did, right? So imagine me, and I write this about in my book, imagine me, a boy in Calcutta, right, who's always hearing pastors every morning say, oh, dipping into the Ganges is, makes you a sinner, and idolatry makes you a sinner, and so on and so forth. And then merely going away for a 10-day break of Durga Puja.
Right.
Right? I mean, look at the dichotomy between those two things. And at some point, you begin to question your identity, and you're like, but why am I doing all these, all these backward, primitive things? Are they really backward and primitive? And you don't find the answers. And then you see that there is this entire hegemonic thing in academic discourse and popular discourse in India, which consistently tells you that all of this is very sort of primitive and what is all this dirty. And therefore the anger comes.
I mean, this is
so
a
the
question
anger
that
reacts.
I have. I mean, what you say has an element of truth. There's no denying the fact.
Yeah.
But if Hinduism, and it is a fact, it
Yeah.
is a philosophy,
Yeah.
the books are always questioning.
Yes.
In fact, there are shlokas in Rigveda, they
Yeah.
even question the existence of God.
Yeah, I mean, we were just discussing in Nasadya Sukta, yeah.
So why would someone be repulsed by it? I mean, I'm talking from a left's perspective. I mean, this is a book which is full of questions. This is a book which is not accusing anyone, which is not telling anyone to come and follow me or, do whatever. These are the strict rules. And if you read a book like that, it's a philosophical treatise, let's put it that way.
Well,
why would people be offended?
Yeah, but I have a political response to this because
Yeah.
I think we should see this from the prism of politics. Because, you understand this as well as I do. Academia is run by politics, right? And that discourse then seeps into what we call popular discourse, right? India is in a very unique place. Remember, India is perhaps the only civilization, right, which could not be conquered, right? Islam couldn't conquer and convert it, right, entirely. Colonialism couldn't conquer and convert it and make it Christian. Communism couldn't run a revolution here. We are the only society where three of the biggest traits or strains of modern political ideology and modern political ideology with communism, and before that religious ideology, right, and including political ideology via colonialism, none of these three big powers, so to speak, could impact India. India remained what it was, largely. I mean, there would be pockets and so on and so forth. But India could not be conquered, it could not be converted, and a revolution could not be brought about in India. Why? We have to ask the big question. I think at this point in our history where all of this polemical conversation is happening, we have to ask why conversion, colonialism, and communist revolution failed in India. What is it about this land and civilization that these three extremely powerful forces could not make a dent in India? And the reason is...
I mean, when you say dent, it's not, communism exists, we were
It does,
conquered.
but there was no revolution in India.
Okay.
Unlike in China, for instance.
Right.
There wasn't a giant revolution, a transformative revolution that included millions of people that transformed the country, is what I'm trying to say. Right? We were never conquered and converted en masse.
Yeah.
There would be pockets and there would be some and so on and so forth. But that scale was never achieved.
So maybe our diversity has a lot to do with that.
And our cultural roots, our diversity, and because those cultural roots are essentially diverse and pluralistic, that I think of Hinduism as this uniquely assimilatory, shape-shifting,
Right.
Philosophy, which accommodates, assimilates, fights back, is able to do all these things. And it's because Hinduism is so, how should I put it, flexible, that it's able to do this. Because if it was rigid, it would be either broken or bent. Mm-hmm. That it is neither broken nor bent is the source of our strength. And I don't want it to become inflexible, because if we do, we will lose our strength.
Right. So I like these thought experiments. So let me pose one to
Sure,
you. So
sure.
I read your many anecdotes that your schooling was done through a Christian missionary
Yes,
school,
yes.
and you went to Jamia.
Yes.
So
I consider Christianity and Islam as two great influences on my thinking.
Right.
And I think it is because I went to a Christian school and a Muslim college, so to speak, that I could distill my own thoughts on pluralism and interacted closely with those theologies, and therefore I could write the book that I wanted to write about what I believe in.
Right. So you were born of Hindu parents.
Yes.
Now the thought experiment is this, that the moment you were born, maybe
Yeah.
5 minutes after that,
Yeah.
you were switched and you were mistaken,
Yeah.
and you were taken by Muslim parents.
Yes.
Do you think you would have been able to write this book? Do you think you would have been able to move away from Islam, or let's say Christian parents move
Yeah.
from Christianity? Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that are your thoughts about Hinduism, are your thoughts, have they come after a lot of thinking, a lot of distillation of what all religions are, or is it because you were always Hindu? That and you do talk about your father talking about Darwinism and everything. It was very interesting. So would you have started to doubt the religion that you took on by mistake?
Yeah.
Would you have done so?
It's a very interesting experiment. Let me answer you. Number one, I begin the book asking the question, what does being Hindu mean? Am I Hindu because my parents are Hindu and my grandparents are Hindu, and before that my parents and grandparents were Hindus, right? Am I Hindu because all my ancestors were Hindu is the question. And is that the only reason I should be Hindu? Because if you ask me if that's the only reason that I am Hindu, then I should really reconsider it, because there is no intellect in it. I have not reasoned it out. I am just blindly following a faith that has been passed on to me by my forefathers. Right. And I have a problem with that. I have an intellectual problem with that, right?
Because that sense of questioning is gone.
Doesn't exist, right? Because it has been passed on to me, and I'm just following that faith. So I'm repulsed by the idea. I don't believe in that idea. Therefore, I want to engage and question.
But if you were switched?
But if I was switched, I think I would have still engaged. I would have still engaged with the faith, with Hinduism or any other faith for that matter, with the same intricacy as I do even in this book. Let me give you an example why. Let me give you an illustrative example why. One of my most favorite parts of the book talks about a man called Dara Shikoh, who nobody wants to talk about in India.
Yes.
We all want to talk about Aurangzeb, but we don't want to talk about Dara Shikoh. Why? Because Dara Shikoh is this defining moment when Islam and Hinduism come together. Remember, here is a man who's a prince, a Mughal prince no less, right? He's a man who brings together the greatest scholars available to him. To do what? To translate Hindu texts into languages that he understood best, in the languages of the Mughal court, so to speak, right? And bring together a fusion of theologies, right? And what does he get for that? Remember, and this is fascinating, and when I was reading the book, it was fascinating. Dara Shikoh is finally killed, as we all know. But what were the grounds on which he's killed? Of course, Aurangzeb finally kills him and so on and so forth. But it's not easy for a prince to kill another prince, because the bloodline is the same, right? Unless you can prove that the prince concerned has actually gone against your version of understanding God. So it is by proving through hardliners that Dara Shikoh was an infidel, a heretic,
It's a pretty
that
grisly and gut-wrenching
that he's
account
killed. Remember, this is a man who tries to bring together the greatest synthesis between Islam and Hinduism, and finally that contributes to becoming one of the pillars of reason through which he can be murdered.
Yeah.
So, but do you hear that? I mean, were you taught this story when you were growing up, Anand?
No.
No. Why? I mean, isn't it time in our history to ask why? We've been shouting and screaming about let's change this road. And let me be clear, I am for changing the name of Aurangzeb from a road in Delhi, because I think Aurangzeb does not in any shape or form exemplify the kind of, person we want to hold up as an example in our own history, right? I would much rather, it has been named APJ Abdul Kalam Road, I would much rather that road be named after Dara Shikoh. Why can we not have a Dara Shikoh road? And that's my problem. You see, when we have selectively picked up characters to either denigrate or deify, we have been extremely, our prism that we have used has been extremely political. Otherwise, why on earth are we not celebrating? If we are truly for secularism, I ask you this, Anand, if in India in 2015 we are truly for secularism, we are truly for pluralism, why are we not celebrating a Muslim man, a Muslim prince, a Muslim ruler, potentially a potential ruler called Dara Shikoh? Why? There is no answer. You will only get a deafening silence.
Right.
And that's my problem.
So I think we're kind of short of time, little bit short of time.
Sure.
So let me just.
I'll give you a quick answer. But anyway, I'm sure you can edit out. Huh?
Yeah. So we haven't really touched upon. You do mention that Hinduism is a tolerant concept. You know. And in fact, we've been having this intolerance debate over the last month, 2.5 months. That's all we've been doing. And I, for one, believe that intolerance hasn't increased. But I, for one, believe that India has always been intolerant. Intolerant of gays, intolerant of women, intolerant of castes, Dalits, and all that. So how do you reconcile with this facet? And let me also just put it that population genetics has shown that between 1900 and 4,200 years ago, there was vigorous mixing of ANI, which is ancestral North Indian population, ASI, and then suddenly it stopped. And that the time when it stopped was the writing of Manusmriti. So, I mean, it's not that Hinduism is devoid of all the ills that still persist.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, how can you call Hinduism as a tolerant book or a philosophy or whatever when you have so much intolerance that has, gone on like a river? I mean, it is.
Well, I have a very simple answer to that. The biggest power that Hinduism gives us is that it leaves it to you. Nobody can tell you that you have to go and follow the words of Manusmriti. If you have a Gandhiji himself, what is Gandhiji himself saying? If these discriminations are written in some text, reject that text.
Right.
So I'll give you an example. I never took the sacred thread, though every adult male member of my family took it. I rejected it. I reject my caste identity. I have always rejected my caste identity, and I reject my caste identity today because I do not believe any identity that comes only via birth or can only be acquired via birth is an identity worth having.
So here's the thing, you see, I mean.
So I can proudly reject my caste identity and not take the sacred
sure
and I am a proud Hindu.
Yes.
I am a proud Hindu having rejected my caste identity. I openly say it. I say it again and again.
Of course. I mean, that is to be appreciated by me because, I mean, it's the same. Millions of others, maybe hundreds of thousands of people have done that. But the point remains that majority of people haven't done it. You see, otherwise we would not have seen so much intolerance against Dalits, the conversions, mass conversions that Dr. Ambedkar said, converted to Buddhism was principally because of this intolerance of Hinduism.
Of course.
So, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is that are only those people who really delve deep into the philosophy of Hinduism must then reject the ills of Hinduism. In other words, is there anything in the text that kind of compels people to question so vigorously, even people not as enlightened as you are, let's put it that way, so that majority of people are able to think quickly, rather than it taking hundreds of years.
But I come to the same point, because we were never educated right. We were never told, look, the greatest power of Hinduism is that it does not have a defining text, even if it is written in a text. and I say this openly, even if it is written in a foundational text that I must discriminate as a Hindu discriminating another fellow human being, I have the ability to openly reject it.
Right.
And I do. Now, you will only have that sense prevailing among millions of people, as you say, if you're taught that. I mean, we were discussing this right before this interview. Vivekananda is a classic example. Yeah. Most people who talk about Vivekananda have never read Vivekananda. Vivekananda is constantly saying through volume after volume of his writings, reject such rituals and nonsense. Do you know Vivekananda was really scared that he would also be deified, and he didn't want to be deified. He's constantly saying that if your idea of reaching God or God realization is tied to the kitchen, into food and into rituals, you will never, I mean, this is a stupid and a foolish thing. Famously, he writes a letter, and I mentioned this right at the beginning of the book. Vivekananda is writing a letter, and let me read that bit to you, about his own spiritual master, right? About Ramakrishna Paramhans, who's an unlettered village man. He's saying, what nonsense about the miracle of Ramakrishna, as if he had nothing to do in the world but turn wine into Gupta's medicine.
Right.
So he's a man who's rejecting miracles.
Yeah.
You know, and we have an India full of Babas and all sorts of nonsense. Here's one of the greatest, figures of Hinduism saying, this is rubbish, and I reject it not only in the future or in the past, I reject it about my own spiritual master.
So basically what you're saying is that people who are, so one need not necessarily reject the ills of Hinduism after reading Hinduism, but we can also listen to people who have rejected the ills of Hinduism. And so we need more people like that.
And we need to know more about people like that. We have all that knowledge that we have has been blocked. You tell me, who teaches you in our entire schooling that the Nasadya Sukta, which is one of the primary verses of the Rig Veda itself, actually questions even the existence of God?
Right.
Were you ever taught this in school? I certainly wasn't.
No, I wasn't. Right. So let me, I mean, we're really running short of time, so I have a couple of questions. I can't let you go without delving into this wonderful chapter, which was, is God afraid of science? So here, in fact, you mentioned Galileo being castigated by a church, and you mentioned there is no example of such thing happening in Hinduism. That in fact struck me. I never thought of it like that, which is probably true. But then you go on to mention, you quote Vivekananda saying, Vivekananda actually embraced the theory of evolution, and there you quote him, if we have a soul, so have they meaning animals, and if they have none, neither have we. It is absurd to say that man alone has a soul and the animals none. So I have to disagree there a little bit, because the concept of soul is there is no such, I mean, it has been. Yeah,
so he's probably talking about consciousness.
Yeah, so what I meant to say was that when you try and bring together or kind of fit into the jigsaw, whatever Vivekananda might be saying, who was not a scientist. When you kind of fix it with what science, theory of evolution says, I mean, is there a dichotomy there? I mean, when you talk of soul and at the same time you talk of theory of evolution, isn't that contradictory?
No, I don't think so. I mean, he's of course using the idiom and the semantics that is available to him, which he's choosing to use. My fundamental point there is no real rejection. At no point is even a taller figure as Vivekananda coming out and saying, as the church argued for the longest time, that it does not exist. I mean, I was in school in the 90s when we used to sing this song, did Charlie make a monkey out of you? Do you think we were, you should live in a zoo? Which is a direct sort of negating the Darwinian theory. Charles Darwin.
So let's put it this way. I mean,
there is no negation.
Yes. So there may be acceptance through, falsehood or ignorance, let's put it that way.
Yeah, acceptance through idioms and semantic that perhaps are not familiar to us, and which we ought to question. Of course, we ought to question. But my larger point is that at no point in the stream of thought in major Hindu figures is there a rejection of science. At no point is any of these people saying, no, whatever science says is wrong. Look, this text says this, and therefore we believe this.
So, Hindol, I mean, I come to my final question. In fact, all we've done in the last wonderful half an hour has been, throw up a lot of questions, and we're not sure of the answers. But it's been a wonderful, and that's what, in fact, that is the message, singular message, if I may say so, of this book, and everyone should read Being Hindu. So, the last question is, there are a lot of people who have lately started psychoanalyzing Hinduism.
I don't name any of them in
Right.
the book, though.
No, well, I mean, I will in a moment, but I per se found it a very endearing concept, a very enchanting concept, let's put it there. So the question is this: what if suddenly Wendy Doniger, you were to put her on Freud's couch?
Yes.
How do you think Freud would analyze her?
I think with, well, I mean, I think Freud would be pleased that she manages to take his theories where he could have never thought or suggested they would go.
Right.
And I do not doubt that she's a scholar. Is she right about many things that she writes about? Well, it's her perspective, and as a Hindu, I don't deny her perspective.
But you aren't offended by her book?
I am not offended by most things. I'm not somebody who takes quick offense. But I do believe that if people believe that, and believe very powerfully and strongly that she is wrong about something, it is incumbent upon them to present evidence, and it is incumbent upon her especially to answer that evidence instead of dismissing them as the lunatic fringe.
Right.
Because finally, remember, and since you brought up Wendy Doniger, I didn't want to, but since you brought up Wendy Doniger, let's be really clear. Even today, while we are sitting here doing the interview, doing this interview, Wendy Doniger's book is back on the shelves in India.
It is.
I don't think that is being spoken about as much. It is back on the shelves in India. There was a court case against Wendy Doniger. I think it was incumbent upon Wendy Doniger and her publishers or whoever represents her to fight that case in court with evidence.
Absolutely.
That they chose not to shows weakness of their argument in my eyes. If I am convinced about the argument that I am presenting, Anand, then I should be able to defend it to the last, right? No matter what it costs me. If that argument is really powerful, and if I really believe in that argument, and if I sneak away, and if I, basically backtrack on my argument and try to use politics to cover up for that backtracking, I think it shows a weakness in the argument itself.
So the same publisher has published Being Hindu. Now, God forbid, if somebody were to take serious offense to your book, Hindol, let's say Mr. Batra, and would put a case on you, and Penguin were to take a decision that let's pulp Hindol Sengupta's Being Hindu,
sure.
What would be your reaction?
I would accept it as a tolerant Hindu. I would accept that decision too. I would, but if it came to a court case, if it came to a court case, I would fight it.
Yeah.
I would choose to fight it. And I think Wendy Doniger should have fought it. If she had real evidence, she should have fought it and fought for her arguments.
On that note, Hindol, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
About Being Hindu. It's published by Penguin, and it's on all bookshops, in all bookshops now. And remember, as Abhinandan keeps reminding us every week, when people pay, people are served. When corporations pay, corporations are served. Support independent media. Pay to keep news free. Support News Laundry. Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed that, click up here to support us and down here to subscribe. Be sure to check out our older episodes and the other stuff we do, like Can You Take It, I Agree, panel discussions, comics and animations, and much, much more.